Hey everybody, this is Mike Conforti, aka Manny Faces, producer of Newsbeat, and we're here with another episode of BackBeat, the behind-the-scenes listen to our podcast series Newsbeat, where we take an unconventional view of conventional wisdom, smack it, flip it, and rub it down with some music and some original lyrical contributions from some amazing artists, and deliver it to you in your favorite podcast app or on our website at www.usnewsbeat.com. As always, for our BackBeat episodes, I'm joined by our editor-in-chief, Chris Twarowski. What's up, Chris?
Yo, yo.
And, of course, our managing editor, Rashed Mian.
Good to have you back in the studio.
It's nice to be here, man. Nice to be here. We're gathered here today to discuss Chelsea Manning, Collateral Murder Cover-Up, our most recent Newsbeat episode. Hopefully you've caught it, and if you're listening to this now but you haven't, just kind of backtrack to the full podcast feed and check out that full episode. Really an eye-opening look into something that was a very newsworthy incident, but that maybe not many people knew that much about. So that's what we do at Newsbeat. So let's start out with it. You know, who is Chelsea Manning? I know people heard the name, or maybe Bradley Manning, but don't know exactly the whole deal. Now, obviously the episode goes into it, but who's Chelsea Manning?
Right, so Chelsea Manning is a former U.S. Army soldier responsible for what stands as the largest leak of sensitive and classified information in U.S. history. This includes hundreds of thousands of internal military documents detailing the mechanics of our wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, diplomatic cables, which shed a light on how we really felt about some of our allies. And I think for Rashed and I and so many others out there, the most gruesome footage, which was audio and video cockpit footage of a U.S. Apache gunship as it killed more than a dozen innocent civilians, including two Reuters journalists in Iraq. And that was, so all these disclosures were released to WikiLeaks, who published them as the Iraq War Logs and Afghan Diary.
Right.
And that video footage became known as Collateral Murder.
Hence the title of our episode.
Right.
We'll talk about the cover-up part. I think that's something we want to get into as well. Chelsea Manning, known then as Bradley Manning,
Right.
leaked these documents. WikiLeaks, which was WikiLeaks kind of big by then, or did this kind of put them on the map?
Well, Julian Assange, the mercurial leader of WikiLeaks, founded it, I believe, in 2006. They were at that point leaking sensitive information from around the world, but this was obviously
like the mother lode for them.
This put them on the map.
Now, real quick, let's say, okay, so WikiLeaks, why did Manning at the time go to WikiLeaks? Or matter of fact, didn't initially go to WikiLeaks, right? This was information that she thought was important, obviously enough to bring to public attention as the episode and as her story details. But WikiLeaks is kind of a shady operation at first, right?
So one of the little known aspects of Chelsea Manning's case is that WikiLeaks was sort of a fallback option. After she obtained these documents and the Collateral Murder video, which she had access to because she was an intelligence analyst for the U.S. Army, and It was part of her job to gather this information. She initially had reached out to the New York Times, Washington Post, and Politico, and none of those three organizations bit. We found out this information during Chelsea Manning's court-martial after she had pled guilty to 10 of the 22 charges against her. She did not plead guilty to charges under the Espionage Act or the most serious of those crimes, aiding the enemy.
Right.
So when Manning had this information, she wanted to reach out to the New York Times, so she reached out to the public editor. And that's not someone who is actually an investigative reporter. That's someone who actually reports on the newspaper itself. It's sort of a dying role in the media industry. It's unclear why Manning actually reached out to the public editor instead of a known investigative journalist.
Right.
So the New York Times had said that Manning had left a voicemail and they actually weren't aware of it. So it didn't go down to the newsroom. She reached out to the Washington Post, and according to Manning, she got on the phone with somebody, and it seemed as if they didn't have interest in in the documents that she had obtained and that she wanted to provide. And it's unclear what happened with Politico, but it's one of those lesser known aspects of the case because people just assumed Manning went straight to WikiLeaks. And at that time, you think of WikiLeaks as sort of like a hacking organization.
Right.
And the name sort of alludes to a shadowy organization, which it's not. It's really a publisher. So you think of it as a media organization that obtains documents and puts it out to the public.
Which the newspapers themselves, after receiving information, often do now, right? They're often criticized for it because it's sort of government stuff, and maybe their role isn't to publish certain things, but they do it also.
Yeah,
and WikiLeaks just does it without.
Right.
They don't care.
And eventually, after the second set of documents were released, newspapers started to work alongside WikiLeaks.
Right.
So you had the New York Times, you had the Guardian, which is UK based, but they have a United States operation. You have Der Spiegel, one of the main German alternative magazines.
They had like a partnership or something.
Yeah, so they worked together with WikiLeaks. So it's sort of ironic that Manning had actually reached out to them first, and then it was these organizations that helped pass off this information to the public. And it's also interesting when we get later into the discussion about Manning's trial and how many reporters who belong to the mainstream media didn't actually cover Manning's trial.
I was going to say, though, a quick question would be, is the belief that the newspapers that Manning approached really just didn't recognize the significance of what was being presented to them, or didn't want to touch it?
Well, I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, I think at that point, all of us here in the studio have been in working newsrooms, and sometimes calls come in. The Washington Post call, I mean, you would imagine that if somebody got that call, depending upon what was relayed,
right.
I mean, where do you want to meet? You've got internal documents, that
are showing a potential war crime.
Right. So it is possible that that person, at least, maybe didn't know the full significance of what she was trying to share. Once
it got out, though, the significance was pretty clear. Obviously, these giant organizations all teaming up and putting this out there. It was very newsworthy at the time. It definitely made some noise.
Yeah, and the government responded.
I was going to say, like, what then happened? Like, obviously,
swift and furiously.
Yeah, so, I mean, the government was obviously outraged at these documents, and the collateral murder video in particular was released. I mean, that video showed the slaying of innocent civilians, people who were killed actually trying to help the civilians who were shot. And, at the time, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton called the leaks an attack on the international community.
Right. It was framed as you're jeopardizing national security by leaking these documents in the first place.
And not only jeopardizing national security, but also endangering assets abroad.
Right.
People who lived in Iraq and Afghanistan, who built a relationship and a rapport with members of the military who were aiding them, and the government was trying to claim that by leaking these documents, those people were endangered, as well as members of the United States military, and which our guests talk about in this episode, was highly problematic, and the government to this day has not provided any evidence to support the notion that Manning's leaks actually harmed people abroad or members of the military.
How did they actually pin it to Manning?
She confided in this former hacker, I believe through instant message, and this
turned government
confidant,
informant.
Right?
Was she trying to get Was she still trying to get the information out at that point, or was this?
No, it appears that Manning just wanted to talk to somebody. All right, so
it's leaked, it's out, it's news.
So let's
Manning's gotten away with it so far, but
so in Manning's case at the time, even when she had enlisted, she had informed Army officials that she had suffered from obsessive compulsive disorder, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, and anxiety, and also, as we all know, battled gender dysphoria because she actually identified as a female. So there's some of these issues that came to play internally, affected some of her decision making and that process. So you could sort of see why she was confiding in somebody after she leaked these documents. In this chat log, which was first obtained by Wired through, I believe, the actual government informant, she had said, I can't believe I'm paraphrasing here, but she said, I can't believe I'm confiding in you about this. So this is where she actually admits that she was the source of the WikiLeaks dump.
Wow. And up until then, the government hadn't pinned it on her to that point.
No, it hadn't come out publicly that they were investigating Manning at the time.
So as of course you've hopefully heard in the episode some of the conditions that she had to face while she was detained. Well, I guess it goes to the question of whether or not you think that what she did was right or wrong, whether you have empathy or sympathy for what she had to go through. But some of the conditions she had to face when she was detained were the government wasn't playing around.
Well, she was held in solitary confinement for, I believe, up to 9 months. And this was
awaiting trial.
This is pre-trial confinement, held in solitary confinement, and civil rights groups and human rights groups were coming out against this, claiming this is essentially torture. You're leaving somebody in there for 9 months who shouldn't be in solitary confinement. It actually escalated to the point where the United States Special Rapporteur on Torture came out and condemned the way the United States government was treating her.
Wow.
Also, the U.S. State Department spokesperson at the time was so incensed by this treatment of Manning that he actually resigned his post as the chief spokesperson of the U.S. State Department.
Oh, interesting.
So there was, you had an international backlash,
right,
and then you had backlash at home,
right,
and this also just was part of the narrative that the United States government, when it comes to whistleblowing,
right,
the way they treat these people is sort of inhumane,
right,
when what they're doing is they're actually leaking information about potential war crimes that were not necessarily committed by the United States, though in the case of collateral murder, when you see unarmed civilians being slaughtered, you can make that case. But there's also war crimes that were committed by other countries that the government is accused of covering up.
Right.
And so when you think about how they're responding to accusations of war crimes, and sort of willy-nilly about it, and the way they're treating Manning, there's obviously a double standard there.
Yeah, and I mean, one of the reasons why we did this episode was because we felt that the heart of these revelations, as Rashed just mentioned, and on the episode, one of our sources mentioned, war crimes has been sort of obscured, at this point, largely to do with hysteria, government manufactured, some would argue, hysteria regarding the gender dysphoria that was basically just regurgitated and spread by an unquestioning, mainstream media.
And that's part of it. I think a big part of it was the distraction, I guess, of the Bradley into Chelsea transformation that occurred, and sort of that was where they tried to direct the narrative to take the spotlight away from what they, meaning the government, might have done wrong. But let me ask something. This is just kind of off notes here. But so, what did the government say? Like, well, yeah, we killed some civilians, but it was an accident. Like, how did they try to defend themselves from the fact that what was released was evidence of a war crime? Didn't they have a defense and say, well, things happen, it's war?
Well, their defense was the people who they saw in this Apache helicopter video, it appeared as if they were carrying weapons. So in the case of the 2 Reuters journalists who were killed in that attack, they had
video cameras.
They had assumed that the video cameras were weapons. And one of our guests in this episode, Kevin Gostola, who reported on Manning's court-martial, which we'll get into, he talked about the bloodlust in their voice. I mean, you could hear them actually, using expletives and actually
cheering,
sound excited, and they really want to start shooting at these people who do not have weapons, who weren't carrying weapons, but were killed anyway.
And again, maybe just playing, little devil's advocate, the fog of war, these things happen. And how does the government today, even to this day, justify what they did?
Well, it's not some, you could talk about the justification, but the main point is that this incident was never made public. So the government says that they weren't trying to cover it up, but no one would have known of this event if it wasn't leaked. We wouldn't have known that innocent people were slaughtered if it wasn't leaked. So you can make that argument that there's this fog of war aspect to this. But
it would have been, hey, Reuters, your journalists were killed in action, tough break, but not.
They never explicitly came out and talked about that because this incident was never made public.
And I think that it's important to note that in Chelsea's explanation, it was that bloodlust, it was that, laughing that you can hear on the audio when a good Samaritan, comes and tries to bring some of the wounded to a hospital, and someone is run over by the truck. I mean,
Right.
you know, and that was part of at least Chelsea's justification for trying to get it out.
Right. Not only were these civilians and it turns out to be not combatants, but just the callousness and almost even if they were, there's sort of, I don't want to say etiquette, in war, but there are certain lines you can't cross even in war. I mean, I guess.
Well,
so.
and you could just imagine in Manning's case, I never want to get into somebody's head.
Yeah.
But even when I rewatch this video, it's as if I'm watching it for the very first time. It's blood curdling. It's pretty hard. It's pretty difficult to watch people just getting killed.
Yeah.
So you can sort of imagine what Manning was thinking the first time she saw it. I don't know how many times she watched it before she leaked it.
Right.
But when you see something like this, you feel an obligation, and that's what she talks about, an obligation to get this out to Americans to see what the government is doing.
Right. No, fair enough. Absolutely. You guys were actually, and this is a badge of honor, I think, in my humble opinion, you actually covered the court-martial. You were actually physically there during Chelsea Manning's court-martial. You touched upon it earlier that there weren't a lot of journalists covering the court-martial itself, and that leads to I think the snowball effect of not everybody really knowing this whole story because it was sort of just kind of covered journalistically as more hearsay than anything. But tell us what it was like to actually be there covering the trial.
Well, first of all, it was held at Fort Meade, which is also NSA headquarters.
Okay. And it's this is purely government. This is not
military.
Military tribunal kind of thing or whatever they call it.
Court-martial.
Okay, military court-martial.
Yeah. So first of all, there's, and Kevin Costola does a great, during our interview, he really explained all the, there's so many challenges facing journalists, the few that actually went down there. I mean, think about just first of all, going to a military base. I mean, all the intimidation that entails. Your car is searched, your credentials are searched, you're searched, you finally get there and there's no official transcript of the proceedings. So
not like a civilian court.
So you have to write as fast as you can. There's restrictions on
can't record
on right. You can't tweet about it until recess.
Right.
There was no filing of your stories until I believe after recess. You have soldiers walking around with weapons.
Right.
But yeah, we're it is a badge of honor. To us it was at the time one of the most important trials in history. And here we go down there and we don't see anybody from the mainstream media.
Right.
Instead, we find a handful of independent journalists doing their best to inform the public about these proceedings. Among those was aforementioned Kevin Costola, then a reporter for Fire Dog Lake, Adam Klesfeld from Courthouse News Service, Nathan Fuller of the Bradley Manning Support Network, and of course Alexa O'Brien, an independent journalist who made it her mission to perhaps provide the most comprehensive database of all those proceedings. And the Associated Press's David Dishnow is also there.
Yeah, so when you think if you just sort of picture, we sort of drive into this military base, and you're actually put into a separate building. The media was directed into a separate building where you sort of just watched the video from it was basically televised of the proceedings. You
weren't in the room.
You're allowed into the courtroom, but you can't bring. It's pretty difficult to report there. You need a laptop to catch. As Chris has mentioned, there's no transcripts.
Right.
So you really need a computer to not jot down all these notes. So it's quite difficult to be in the courtroom to report on what's going on. Chris had went into the courtroom himself, and he spoke to some of then Bradley Manning, now Chelsea Manning supporters there. Chris and I think the reason why we went down to Fort Meade to cover it, and we did it for about 2 days. I mean, these people that we mentioned were there daily.
Right.
I mean, so
how long did the trial last?
It was about 2 months.
Oh, wow.
So
okay.
they were there daily. They sacrificed a lot to go down and report on this.
Right.
So we don't really want to pat ourselves on the back too much because we were there for a couple of days.
Well, our cover story focused on the job that those reporters did. Again, because we were only there for 2 days. These people were down there.
Right.
They made it their daily mission.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure.
The importance of it is to highlight basically how Manning's leaks and the prosecution of Manning is sort of part and parcel of what at the time was what we viewed the Obama administration's war on whistleblowers and indirectly a war on journalism. You know, so if you're a journalist and you rely on information that comes from a private source, it's important to cover events such as these because this is the lifeblood of journalism. You know, journalism shouldn't just be, you know, waiting at a computer and expecting the government to send a press release about an incident. I mean, it's a large part of it, but you know, at what point is that really journalism?
Right.
You know?
And journalists exist in large part to hold the government and other authorities and institutions to account.
Exactly. And you know what's important? We mentioned the public editor of the New York Times who Chelsea Manning had reached out to. This was a different public editor at the time. Her name is Margaret Sullivan, but she actually chastised the New York Times in her own in the New York Times, saying that they, quote, missed the boat.
Right.
That they should have been there. And then it was at the Manning court-martial where you actually found out that she had reached out to the New York Times, which made that even more significant.
Right.
Which made their absence even more, you know, in some people's minds, even more anathema to the mission of journalism, because they should have been covering this event, which they weren't.
Yeah, and I just want to add, just, you know, thinking back, I mean, it's likely there were more everyday civilians down there than journalists. I mean, there were people that we met from all across the country. I remember interviewing a couple who I believe, I mean, it's been a while, but I believe that they were there because it was this woman's birthday, you know, and she said, "This is important. We need to be there."
Right.
You know, I remember the support network selling shirts. I actually have one. It's a black shirt with the word truth. And, you know, because again, to speak to this episode, that's at the heart of this is we're trying to bring more sunlight to what was actually exposed in Manning's leaks and, you know, rectify this narrative.
Right.
Yeah, and you know, the unfortunate thing about the Chelsea Manning case is that it's sort of devolved into a debate about traitor versus hero, which we outlined in the episode.
Right.
And, you know, the unfortunate thing about that, I think likely because of the absence of many in the media to cover the trial in which much of this information was coming out, where you learned about the leaks, you learned about why Manning did what she did. By not covering the court-martial, the public was sort of left to surmise on their own why she did what she did. And if you watch, you know, news outlets, you know, the Fox Newses and even the CNNs, like I said, the debates were focused on traitor versus hero. But what does that really provide? What benefit does that provide the American public to talk about something in such elementary style? What they should have focused on were the leaks. And, you know, when you talk about the leaks, these leaks, which are still available today, are being cited by news organizations on current day affairs. So not only were they important, you know, 7 years ago when they first hit the internet, they're still important to this day.
Right.
And to have the conversation focus solely on whether Manning, you know, was an enemy to the United States, or if she was a hero for doing what she did, is a disservice.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like how you bring up the point that not only is it, you know, to make sure the government is held to account for, you know, what they do even in times of war. It's not no rules. And you want improvements. We send people to fight overseas. You want them to have the best information. You want them to have the best policies and protocols and procedures to protect their lives. But also the journalism aspect of it is that if everyone is afraid to report on these things, if whistleblowers, if someone in the army or even in corporate America, or look at what's happening with, you know, all the sexual assaults and the Harvey Weinsteins of the world and all these things happening, if you're afraid that there's going to be retribution or jail sentences, you know, out of proportion jail sentences, I think with what Manning faced, these opportunities for improvement in our military or in our corporate world or in society in general are going to be fewer and fewer because people are afraid to speak up. And it lets people who have less than ideal intentions use that to their advantage.
Yeah, and our sources speak to it in the episode, but her sentence of 35 years was to send a message.
Right.
You know, that I believe that's the longest sentence for a whistleblower in U.S. history. So, yeah.
Yeah, it's not mentioned in the episode, but it was President Obama who commuted that sentence. It's ironic, really, that it was under President Obama's justice system and administration that, you know, she was arrested, charged, and prosecuted to the extent that she was. And in the final months of his administration, he commuted her sentence, which at that point was up to 7 years. So she was released, I believe, in May 2017.
Right.
But just talking about the significance, I mean, if you're somebody in the U.S. government or a government contractor, which now is a large portion of government workers, it's contractors. If you come upon something that you do find maybe morally reprehensible or questionable behavior on the U.S. government's part, and you want to leak it,
You're going to think twice.
You're going to have second thoughts.
Yeah.
We had spoken to John Kiriakou, who is in this episode. Chris and I had interviewed him privately for another story, and we had asked him about whether there was sort of a chilling effect on sources. And he came out and said he had spoken to ex-CIA colleagues of his, and one of them in particular called one of his sources, I forget which news organization, and said, look, it's too hot right now. He used the term hot.
Yeah.
I can't really talk to you.
Hot on the block.
People are afraid. And, the other, this doesn't get talked about a lot also, but Chelsea Manning is so important because she has informed other whistleblowers. So you have Edward Snowden, the NSA contractor, who revealed mass surveillance on the government's part. And he has said publicly that it was Manning's treatment that, drove him to leak the documents the way he did, escape basically to Hong Kong, get that information into at least 3 journalists' hands, Glenn Greenwald and Laura Poitras, now of The Intercept, among them, and then try to go to a country with no extradition. He was trying to go to Ecuador, but the United States government revoked his passport when he was in Russia, effectively making him
an exile.
An exile, and then later claiming that he had fled to Russia intentionally, which is not the case. So I only bring this up because if it weren't for Manning, you don't know that Edward Snowden would have leaked the NSA files, and you don't know that he would have done it the way he did, because when you're charged under the Espionage Act, you're prohibited from outlining basically a defense claiming that the leaks were important to American democracy. So you're basically you're handcuffed at that point. If you are prosecuted, you don't really have a defense to turn to. So that's why he did it that way. And that again speaks of Manning's importance. And I think that's why 7 years later, we're still talking about this.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad we're talking about it because I think we do it from an angle that is important, and I think that people get a lot out of it. Kevin Gostola is one of our guests we talked about. John Kiriakou is the other. The last voice on this episode, just a quick shout out,
is Trevor Tim, who is the executive director of the Freedom of the Press Foundation, and the board members of that group include people that we mentioned, Glenn Greenwald,
Yep.
Edward Snowden, the acclaimed whistleblower Daniel Ellsberg,
right.
Laura Poitras. So it really is an all-star cast over there.
Right. And of course, as we often do, we heard from our artist in residence, a hip-hop recording giant, Silent Night, who contributed, once again, just a poignant exclamation point to all of the points brought up during the episode, just really speaking to exactly what this whole thing is about, the injustice of blowing the whistle when it comes to something that's being done that should be given the scrutiny to ensure safety and that a moral compass is being followed. The result shouldn't be these jail sentences.
Right. You would think that, exposing wrongdoing acts against the public would be celebrated.
Right.
Instead, those that do so are too often crucified.
Right. Now, it's probably a larger conversation than a BackBeat, but just to satisfy my curiosity, 2 things. Number one, what is the state of whistleblowing today?
So that's actually a future episode. But
yeah, I knew that.
Currently, there is no, off the cuff, there is no, I think, federal whistleblower shield law.
Okay. So that's something
Right.
that's trying to be.
I mean, if you talk to advocates of whistleblowers, they don't ever expect there to be an actual, broad umbrella federal law protecting whistleblowers.
Let me ask you this then. Who should Chelsea Manning have gone to internally?
Yeah.
And is that, who polices the police?
Well, that's the argument that the government likes to make, that whistleblowers should have gone through the proper channels. Ironically, you have had instances in which whistleblowers actually try to go through the public channels. The Senate Intelligence Committee, in the instance of Jeffrey Sterling, another CIA officer who was was prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Thomas Drake, another NSA employee who was prosecuted under the Espionage Act. Just those two people alone, they actually reached out to government agencies to bring up some of the concerns that they had. And, when nothing is being done and you are so devoted to getting this information out to the public, you really have no one else to turn to other than the media. And I think...
Or an organization like WikiLeaks.
Or an organization like WikiLeaks. Right. And I think it's important because, I could understand why people in the American public think it's a bad thing to leak documents that could potentially endanger American security. But what also isn't often brought up is the fact that the government engages in leaking all the time. They do so in circumstances in which maybe they want to make certain agencies look good, to talk about raids that possibly happen abroad. I mean, that's information that is secret, but they're
choosing to make it public.
They choose to make it public through leaking,
right.
But no one is prosecuted for that. I mean,
right. And I think that, not to cut you off, I think that in the episode it's made clear that the dangers of not releasing this information, of keeping this stuff covered up or unreleased to the public, could be, or there are more dangerous things that are being done than releasing this information.
Yeah, there's a reason why the media is called the fourth estate. I mean, you have the checks, the legislative, judicial, and executive, but like you mentioned before, someone needs to check the government. And, again, I just want to go back to the double standard for a second. I mean, you had one of the most acclaimed films in the last decade was Zero Dark 30, which was about how allegedly the CIA obtained information through torture to kill Osama bin Laden. And the director of that film took part in a classified briefing in which she learned information that wasn't public. So at that point, is that the government engaging in propaganda to make itself look good? And why was nobody held responsible? There was reportedly 2 internal investigations that occurred, but no one was prosecuted for that. You have the instance of former CIA Director General Petraeus, who provided his biographer and mistress classified information, and he got sentenced to 2 years of probation. It was basically a slap on the wrist. Right. So when whistleblowers bring up, the double standard, I think they do have perfect argument.
Yeah. Lastly, I'm just, again, to satisfy my curiosity, what is Chelsea Manning doing now? I know there was something with speaking at Harvard. There was still...
LGBT parade.
Yeah, the march, the Pride March.
Okay.
She's, obviously become an advocate for LGBT issues. She's living her life now as a transgender person. She's open about it.
She was invited to Harvard.
Yes.
It was quickly
rescinded, yeah.
Pressure from
the national security state. Yeah, I mean,
so they still got a grudge?
They still have a grudge, and it's not, the ironic thing about that is Kevin Gostola talked about this, but we couldn't fit into the episode. He talked about how Manning has such, as her, when she was in the Army and her position was as an intelligence analyst, she has a wealth of knowledge to provide to the American public about war making, how maybe America could fight future wars. And Harvard at the Kennedy Center invited her to be a visiting fellow, to spread her knowledge. And then there was an immediate backlash by the national security state, in which you had the current CIA director and the former, he was like the associate CIA director at the time, just swiftly condemn what Harvard had done. And, the United States national security state should not be the ones
dictating who
and who is not a thought leader in America. And, Manning had her offer rescinded, but guess who is a visiting fellow? He goes by the name of Sean Spicer, and he was Donald Trump's official mouthpiece in the early months of his administration, even lying to the American public about a crowd size.
So many things.
Such a minuscule issue. Right. And then obviously the other things that transpired throughout the administration. But, you have Sean Spicer teaching or speaking to young students, even though he's been widely mocked, and sort of even he has acknowledged telling mistruths. But Chelsea Manning is, left out to try to fight the battle her own way. And it just goes to show you how that, like you said, that grudge continues.
Well, listen, guys, it's been great talking to you about this episode. It was eye-opening for me. I always learn something from a Newsbeat episode, and I'm sure you guys do, even though this was right in your wheelhouse. You've covered this so much.
Still learn a lot.
No, I appreciated it. Once again, shouts to Kevin Casola, John Kiriakou, Trevor Tim, Silent Night, everyone here at the Newsbeat team. My name is Manny Faces, and we will be back with the next episode of Newsbeat. Follow us on social media, US Newsbeat. Subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, RSS feed. You can see all of our episodes as well as full stories complementing each audio episode at usnewsbeat.com. Once again, I'm Manny Faces for Chris and Tim. I was going to say Tim. That doesn't even make sense. For Chris and Rashed. Thanks again for listening. We'll catch you next time.
Newsbeat is produced and distributed by MP Studios, a division of Maury Publishing. The producer of Newsbeat is Michael Conforti. The editor-in-chief of Newsbeat is Christopher Twarowski. The managing editor of Newsbeat is Rashed Mian. The executive producer of Newsbeat is Jed Maury. Show notes are available on usnewsbeat.com. Subscribe today on iTunes, Google Play, or wherever you download your favorite podcasts.